It is nearly impossible to speak of Albus Dumbledore without conjuring images of his silver beard, his half-moon spectacles, or that twinkle of omniscience in his eyes. To most, he was the paragon of wisdom, a wizard whose name commanded reverence and trust. But beneath the comforting cloak of the Hogwarts headmaster lay secrets and contradictions, truths both dazzling and devastating. Who was the real Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore? To the unheeded eye, there was no difference between being called Robert Ducklin and driving a wolf from home. To answer that, we must journey beyond the comforting halls of Hogwarts and dive into the murky depths of his past, where ambition, regret, and brilliance intertwine. Dumbledore's story is, above all, one of duality. Born into a family burdened by tragedy, Albus's early life was far removed from the grandeur and power he would later embody. His father, Percival, was sent to Azkaban after attacking Muggles who had tormented his daughter Ariana. This act of desperation, a misguided attempt to protect his family, would cast a long shadow over the Dumbledore household. The story would worry Albus forever. Left to fend for themselves, Kendra Dumbledore, Albus's fierce and private mother, moved the family to Godric's Hollow, where they lived in quiet obscurity. It is here that we first see the delicate tension between Dumbledore's extraordinary gifts and the burden of his circumstances. From a young age, Albus was undeniably brilliant. His academic achievements at Hogwarts were the stuff of legend, and his potential seemed limitless. But while the wizarding world began to whisper his name with awe, Albus's family life became increasingly fractured. Ariana's mysterious and uncontrollable magic, a result of the trauma inflicted on her as a child, demanded constant care. Aberforth, Albus' younger brother, shouldered much of the responsibility, but Kendra's death in a magical accident left Albus at a crossroads. For the first time, he was forced to reconcile his towering ambitions with his familial obligations, a conflict that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Perhaps the most pivotal chapter of Albus's youth was his ill-fated friendship with Gellert Grindelwald, a wizard as brilliant and ambitious as he was dangerous. Grindelwald arrived in Godric's Hollow like a tempest, sweeping Albus into a storm of revolutionary ideas and dangerous ideals. Together, they envisioned a new world order, one where wizards ruled over muggles for the greater good. For Albus, the intoxicating partnership offered not just intellectual stimulation, but also something deeper, the promise of love, understanding, and a kindred spirit. It was a relationship as thrilling as it was destructive. In Grindelwald, Albus glimpsed the seductive power of his own potential, untethered by morality or restraint. But this golden era of camaraderie was short-lived. The infamous three-way duel between Albus, Aberforth, and Grindelwald left Ariana dead, shattering the fragile remnants of the Dumbledore family. The details of that tragic day remain unclear. Who cast the fatal curse? Could it have been Albus himself? This unanswerable question became a source of lifelong guilt for Dumbledore, and it marked the end of his association with Grindelwald. From that moment on, Albus's life was defined as much by what he concealed as by what he achieved. For years, Dumbledore buried the pain of his sister's death beneath a veneer of wisdom and selflessness. He became a teacher, a mentor, a master manipulator of events in service of the greater good. But as we examine his life, we must ask, was Dumbledore truly the benevolent figure we believed him to be, or did his own mistakes shape him into the man who orchestrated a war against the darkness he once courted? His connection to Grindelwald never truly severed. It lingered in the shadows, influencing his decisions long after the Dark Wizard's rise and fall. Albus knew the cost of power and the allure of it, and this understanding would inform his relationship with another powerful, burdened boy years later, Harry Potter. When Harry Potter first met Albus Dumbledore, the boy saw only a kindly, eccentric old wizard who exuded a quiet confidence. But as we peer deeper into Dumbledore's choices and motivations, it becomes clear that Harry's perception, while not wrong, was incomplete. Dumbledore's carefully cultivated image as the infallible guardian of the light was a mask, one that concealed the complexity of his character and the moral compromises he made along the way. Consider Dumbledore's relationship with Harry. It is tempting to view him simply as a mentor, someone who guided Harry through trials and prepared him for the monumental task of defeating Voldemort. But the truth is far murkier. From the moment Dumbledore discovered Harry's status as the boy who lived, he began orchestrating a plan, a meticulous and at times merciless strategy to ensure Voldemort's defeat. Ordinarily, Dumbledore withheld critical truths from Harry, even as he offered just enough guidance to keep the boy moving along the path he had set. Was this manipulation born of necessity? Or was it another instance of Dumbledore placing the greater good above individual well-being? One cannot overlook the chilling moment when Dumbledore confided in Severus Snape that Harry was a pig for slaughter. The phrase cold and calculating has sparked endless debate among fans and scholars alike. Did Dumbledore view Harry as nothing more than a tool, a means to an end? Or did he compartmentalize his emotions, convincing himself that his decisions were the only way to achieve lasting peace? Perhaps it was both. Dumbledore's willingness to make the hardest choices is undeniable, but those choices often came at great personal and moral cost. In guiding Harry to his destiny, Dumbledore not only played the role of protector, but also that of chess master, moving pieces with ruthless precision. Even as we scrutinize Dumbledore's flaws, his achievements and sacrifices cannot be dismissed. He was a man who learned from his past, however imperfectly. The youthful arrogance that once blinded him to the consequences of his ambitions gave way to a deep humility, one that informed his leadership during the First and Second Wizarding War. Dumbledore understood Voldemort better than anyone, not just because of his intellect, but because he recognized in the Dark Lord the same thirst for power he had once seen in himself. This understanding was Dumbledore's greatest strength and his greatest burden. His refusal to seek the position of Minister for Magic, despite being eminently qualified, was one such example of his self-awarenessness. Dumbledore feared the corrupting influence of power, a fear rooted in his own tumultuous past. Instead, he chose the quieter, more humble role of headmaster, a position that allowed him to nurture and guide young minds while staying firmly in the background. Yet, even as he shunned the limelight, Dumbledore's influence was felt throughout the wizarding world. He was a strategist, a scholar, and a warrior when necessary, a man who understood that true leadership often requires stepping back, even as one shoulders the heaviest of burdens. But perhaps the most poignant aspect of Dumbledore's story is his deep loneliness. For all his wisdom and accomplishments, he was, at heart, a man haunted by his failures and regrets. His bond with Harry, flawed though it was, became one of the few connections that brought him solace. In Harry, Dumbledore saw not only a chance for redemption, but also a glimmer of hope that the mistakes of the past need not define the future. And yet, even as he grew close to Harry, Dumbledore maintained an emotional distance, as though afraid to let the boy see the full measure of his humanity. To understand Albus Dumbledore fully, one must also grapple with the contradictions at the core of his philosophy. His infamous motto, "For the greater good," is a haunting thread that weaves throughout his life. What began as a rallying cry during his partnership with Grindelwald would later evolve into a principle that guided his actions as a leader. Yet the phrase carried with it an inescapable taint, a reminder of the dangers of ambition, unchecked by morality. Was Dumbledore's later interpretation of the greater good a genuine attempt to atone for his youthful mistakes? Or was it simply another iteration of the same ideal, cloaked in a new guise? Consider his role in the Wizarding Wars. While Dumbledore was undoubtedly instrumental in Voldemort's defeat, his methods often left others to bear the brunt of the consequences. Time and again, he placed faith in others to carry out dangerous tasks while keeping his own hands as clean as possible. The Order of the Phoenix, a group of brave witches and wizards who followed him without question, fought and sacrificed on the front lines while Dumbledore pulled the strings from behind the curtain. His reluctance to wield direct power himself could be interpreted as humility, but it could just as easily be viewed as a calculated move to maintain his moral high ground. Perhaps the most telling example of Dumbledore's calculated detachment was his decision to leave Tom Riddle at the orphanage after their first meeting. Even as he recognized the boy's immense potential and his capacity for cruelty, Dumbledore chose not to intervene in Riddle's upbringing. Was this an act of faith, believing that Tom's choices would ultimately be his own responsibility? Or was it a failure of compassion, an unwillingness to take responsibility for a child who so clearly needed guidance? The consequences of this decision were catastrophic, not just for the wizarding world, but for Dumbledore himself, as it added another layer to the guilt he carried. And then there is the matter of the Hallows, those legendary objects that played a crucial role in Dumbledore's life and death. His obsession with the Deathly Hallows in his youth, a fixation he shared with Grindelwald, reflected his yearning for mastery over death and fate. This desire was rooted not in malice, but in the heartbreak of losing Ariana and the weight of his perceived failures as her protector. Later, as he matured, Dumbledore came to see the Hallows not as tools of conquest, but as symbols of his own fallibility. His decision to avoid claiming mastery over all three Hallows was a powerful act of self-denial, a conscious rejection of the path that had once led him astray. Yet even this rejection is complicated. Dumbledore's possession of the Elder Wand, arguably the most dangerous of the Hallows, underscores his willingness to wield power when he believed it was necessary. He justified keeping the wand, claiming it was safer in his hands than in anyone else's, a statement that is both true and troubling. For all his wisdom, Dumbledore could not completely separate himself from the allure of power. His death at Snape's hands, carefully orchestrated to preserve the wand's legacy and spare Draco Malfoy from committing murder, was a final act of control, a calculated sacrifice that ensured his plans would continue even after his passing. Dumbledore's relationship with death is, in many ways, the cornerstone of his character. He spoke often of how, to the well-organized mind, death is but the next great adventure, but his actions reveal a more complicated truth. His fear of losing those he loved shaped many of his decisions, from his manipulation of Harry to his tragic entanglement with Grindelwald. Even his pursuit of the Hallows was, at its core, an attempt to defy the inevitability of death. It was only in his later years, as he faced his own mortality, that Dumbledore seemed to find peace with the idea of letting go, a lesson he, in turn, sought to teach Harry. In the end, Albus Dumbledore remains an enigma, a man whose legacy is as much defined by his failures as by his triumphs. His story is not one of simple heroism or villainy, but of a deeply human struggle with power, love, and the weight of responsibility. For all his wisdom, Dumbledore made mistakes, grave ones, that cost lives and fractured relationships. Yet these same mistakes shaped the man who would guide Harry Potter, not with infallibility, but with a hard-earned knowledge of someone who had walked perilously close to the same darkness that threatened to consume his world. Perhaps the most striking truth about Dumbledore is that he was not a savior in the conventional sense. He did not fight Voldemort in a grand final battle, nor did he single-handedly defeat Grindelwald when the Dark Wizard rose to power. Instead, Dumbledore's strength lay in his ability to inspire others to act, even as he bore the burden of knowing that their actions would often come at great personal cost. He saw the flaws in the wizarding world, the prejudice, the corruption, the complacency, and rather than seeking to rule it, he worked quietly to reshape it from within. His leadership was subtle, even invisible at times, but its effects rippled through history. Dumbledore's ultimate legacy, however, is tied to his belief in the power of choice. He understood better than anyone that the line between good and evil is not drawn by one's abilities, but by the decisions one makes. This belief informed his guidance of Harry, whose choices ultimately defined the outcome of the war against Voldemort. By trusting Harry to face his destiny, Dumbledore ensured that the boy would not fall into the same trap of arrogance and ambition that had once ensnared him. And though he withheld the truth about Harry's fate until the final hour, it was not out of cruelty, but out of a belief that Harry deserved the chance to live as a child, even if only for a brief time. Yet, even as we celebrate Dumbledore's wisdom and bravery, we must acknowledge the toll it took on him. His life was a lonely one, marked by the absence of true, lasting companionship. His closest relationships, be they with Grindelwald, Harry, or even his own family, were all tinged with sorrow and loss. He carried these wounds with him to the very end, and though he rarely allowed others to see his vulnerability, they were always there, lurking beneath the surface. This loneliness, perhaps more than anything else, defines the tragedy of Dumbledore's life. For all his brilliance and achievements, he remained, at heart, a man who longed for connection, but feared the pain it might bring. In the years following Dumbledore's death, the wizarding world would come to view him as a towering figure, a symbol of hope and resilience. But as we've uncovered, the reality of his life was far more complex. Dumbledore was not a saint, nor was he a villain. He was, as Harry himself put it, the greatest and the most flawed of men. And perhaps it is this duality that makes him such an enduring and compelling figure. His life, with all its contradictions, invites us to reflect on our own choices, our own burdens, and the ways in which we too navigate the line between light and shadow. As the Hogwarts portrait of Albus Dumbledore gazes down upon the headmaster's office, one imagines him watching over the generations of students who pass through the school's halls, still offering guidance in his quiet, enigmatic way. His story, like the man himself, resists simple conclusions. It challenges us to embrace complexity, to see the humanity in our heroes, and to remember that even the wisest among us are shaped as much by their imperfections as by their ideals. In that, Albus Dumbledore remains not just a figure of legend, but a reflection of us all.